I am Camille, 34 years old, and I recently watched my own family throw me out into a freezing rainstorm. My grandfather passed away without leaving a will, or at least that is what my arrogant father believed. When I arrived home to announce I had lost my job, my dad claimed he inherited the entire estate, sneered that I would not get a single cent, and proudly declared my brother the new heir. But as I stood shivering on the driveway, a sleek black car pulled up. A stranger handed me a sealed envelope and whispered that it was time to show them who really owned their precious mansion. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who underestimated your worth. I stood on the sprawling limestone porch of our $15 million Hamptons beach house. The rain was coming down in heavy, relentless sheets, soaking completely through my trench coat and dripping off the cardboard box I held tightly in my arms. Inside that soggy box were the contents of my office. For the last 10 years, I had worked tirelessly as a senior mergers and acquisitions strategist. My entire career was dedicated to liquidating failing companies and acquiring distressed assets for a massive private equity firm. I was an expert at cutting away dead weight. But tonight, I was the one standing in the cold, being treated like garbage by the people who shared my blood. I pushed open the heavy double doors and stepped inside. The grand foyer was a chaotic flurry of activity. Caterers in crisp white uniforms rushed past with silver trays of appetizers. The air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and roasted truffles. My mother, Beatrice, stood at the base of the grand sweeping staircase. She was obsessed with Hampton's high society, constantly managing our family image to mask the reality of their dwindling bank accounts. When she saw me standing on her pristine marble floor, dripping wet, her face contorted in absolute disgust, she demanded to know what I was doing tracking mud into her house on such an important night. My father, Charles, walked out of his mahogany study. He always played the role of the incredibly successful real estate mogul. He wore a custom Italian suit that effectively hid the truth of his crumbling investments and terrible business decisions. He looked at the wet cardboard box in my hands with a mixture of pity and annoyance. I kept my voice perfectly level and announced that my firm just underwent a massive restructuring. I told them I no longer held my position. I expected perhaps a moment of silence or a shred of parental concern. I received neither. Before my father could even speak, the sharp clack of designer heels echoed across the foyer. It was my sister-in-law, Dominique. She was an Ivy League-educated luxury event planner for the ultra-wealthy. She was impeccably dressed in a stunning $5,000 crimson gown, fierce, incredibly elitist, and deeply integrated into the American high society network. She marched right up to me, her eyes sweeping over my wet clothes with pure, unfiltered contempt. She despised me because I actually worked for a living instead of playing their high society charades. Dominique crossed her arms and sneered that they were hosting Russian investors tonight. She told me a jobless dropout ruins the aesthetic of her carefully curated event. She pointed a manicured finger toward the back of the house and told me to use the servants' gate. With a swift, calculated motion, Dominique kicked the cardboard box right out of my hands. My hard-earned industry awards, my customized pens, and my framed photos clattered onto the wet porch outside, rolling into the puddles. I stared at my belongings scattered in the rain, my jaw tightening. I looked over to see my brother Preston sauntering into the foyer holding a glass of expensive scotch. He was 36, the undisputed golden child of the family, and an entirely incompetent real estate developer who had been handed everything on a silver platter. He just laughed at the sight of my ruined things, taking a slow sip of his drink. My mother stepped forward, her voice dripping with venom. She told me not to look so pathetic. She proudly announced that they had drained my entire college fund to pay for Preston's startup business 10 years ago. She reminded me that I had been on my own since I was 18 and explicitly told me not to come crawling back to them now. Her words were meant to hurt, but they only fueled the analytical fire building inside my mind. They had literally stolen my future to fund my brother's continuous and monumental failures. I had worked 3 grueling jobs to pay my way through college and climb the ruthless corporate ladder while Preston sank millions of their money into catastrophic deals. I told them I was not asking for a handout, keeping my posture straight despite the storm raging outside. I said I just came to tell them the news. My father scoffed loudly. He reached into his perfectly tailored pocket, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and threw it aggressively at my feet. It landed in a dirty puddle right on the threshold. He commanded me to call an Uber and waved his hand dismissively. He declared that Preston was the heir of this house now. He told me I would not get a single cent of this estate, because my grandfather left everything to him, and he was leaving it to his golden son. He reminded me they had billionaires arriving in 20 minutes and ordered me off his property. They turned their backs on me. Dominique signaled for the private security guard to shut the massive doors. I stood there as the heavy wood slammed shut right in my face, locking me out in the freezing downpour. I did not cry. I did not scream. I just stared at the closed door, letting the rain wash over my face. They thought they had won. They thought they had finally crushed me. They truly believed my grandfather had died without leaving a will, allowing my father to inherit the entire estate by default. But they were so completely and utterly wrong. Headlights pierced through the dark, rainy driveway. A pristine black Bentley glided up the circular path and came to a smooth, silent stop right beside me. The back door swung open. A man in a sharp-tailored suit stepped out into the rain holding a large umbrella. It was Donovan, the ruthless trust attorney who had managed my late grandfather's private and highly confidential affairs. He held the umbrella over my head, completely ignoring the chaotic weather soaking his expensive shoes. He reached into his breast pocket and handed me a thick, sealed envelope bearing a wax crest. Donovan leaned in close, his voice cutting clearly through the sound of the heavy rain. He told me my non-disclosure agreement was officially signed. He confirmed the $30 million severance had hit my account exactly 5 minutes ago. And then he whispered that my grandfather's blind trust activates tonight. A slow, dangerous smile spread across my face. My family had just thrown me out into the cold because they thought I was a broke, jobless failure. They thought I had been fired. What they did not know was that I had orchestrated the complete buyout of my own firm, securing a massive exit package that I was legally bound to keep secret until the ink dried. And they certainly did not know that my grandfather had never trusted my father with his wealth. He had secretly placed the family fortune and this very beach house into a blind trust years ago. Donovan opened the door of the Bentley for me and whispered that it was time to tell them who I really was. As a corporate restructuring strategist, I spent my life analyzing toxic assets. I looked at failing companies and decided what to liquidate, what to salvage, and what to completely destroy. Looking at the glowing windows of the mansion, I evaluated my own family with that same cold precision. They were a liability. Their arrogance was a debt they could no longer afford, and I was holding the collection notice. I stepped into the luxurious warmth of the Bentley. The engine purred as we pulled away from the curb. The storm outside was nothing compared to the hurricane I was about to unleash upon them. The heavy armored door of the Bentley closed instantly, silencing the torrential rain and the muffled shouting still echoing from the mansion porch. The interior smelled of rich leather and aged scotch. Donovan sat across from me, his silver hair perfectly in place despite the storm raging outside. He handed me a crisp linen towel. I wiped the freezing rain from my face, keeping my expression completely neutral. I had spent a decade navigating the ruthless world of corporate mergers and acquisitions. I knew better than to let my emotions show even after my own family had just thrown me out like garbage. Donovan tapped the screen of a secured tablet and turned it toward me. A 9-figure bank balance glowed brightly in the dim light of the luxury car. The wire transfer cleared exactly 4 minutes ago. He noted a sharp smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The $30 million is sitting safely in your private offshore account. The non-disclosure agreement is fully executed. Your former board of directors was absolutely furious when they realized you engineered the buyout to force your own golden parachute. I handed the towel back to him and straightened my damp collar. They wanted to restructure my department to save their profit margins, I replied coldly. I simply accelerated their timeline. I liquidated 2 of our failing subsidiary branches, acquired our biggest rival, and backed the executive board into a corner. They wanted me gone because I had full access to their unregulated tax shelters. The $30 million was not a severance package. It was hush money, and the non-disclosure agreement guarantees they can never publicly discuss the takeover. They get their restructuring, and I get my capital. It is just business. Donovan chuckled softly, reaching down to grab a heavy leather briefcase from the floorboard. He clicked the brass locks open. Speaking of capital, your father is currently inside that house, pouring $1,000 champagne for foreign investors, boasting about his massive new inheritance. Charles has spent the last month telling the entire Hamptons high society that your grandfather Theodore died intestate. I took the heavy leather-bound ledger Donovan offered me. My father always believed he was the rightful king of this family, I said, running my hand over the worn cover. He thinks because Grandpa Theodore did not read a dramatic will at a mahogany table, the entire real estate empire defaulted to him as the only son. Charles truly believes he owns every brick of that beach house. Donovan adjusted his tailored cuffs. Theodore knew Charles was a financial parasite. He watched your father and your brother Preston bleed the family firm dry for years. He watched them fund Dominique's extravagant event-planning galas for the ultra-wealthy. He watched Preston sink millions into catastrophic luxury condo developments that never broke ground. Theodore was a self-made man. He was never going to leave his legacy to men who treat toxic debt like a status symbol. I traced my finger down the first column of the ledger. The dates went back exactly 5 years. The financial records were meticulous, detailing massive transfers of assets and real estate holdings. What did Grandpa do? I asked, my eyes scanning the heavily redacted account numbers. He established a blind trust, Donovan stated smoothly, his voice dropping into a serious legal register. 5 years ago, Theodore funneled the entirety of the estate into a holding company. He transferred the deed to the $15 million beach house you just got kicked out of, along with the seed capital for your family investment firm, directly into Vanguard Holdings LLC. He completely bypassed the probate courts. Charles does not own the house. Preston is not the heir. They are living in a fantasy. I turned to the final page of the ledger. A crisp, notarized legal document stared back at me. My eyes scanned the executive summary, moving past the complex legal jargon until I landed on the designated chief executive officer and sole proprietor. My name was printed there in bold black ink. Camille. I own Vanguard. I whispered, the reality clicking into place with the precision of a combination lock. I own the estate. You own everything, Donovan corrected. But there is a massive complication. Look at the attached banking statements on the next page. I flipped the heavy parchment paper over. My blood went cold, then immediately ran hot with a surge of pure adrenaline. Highlighted in bright red ink were 3 massive liens against the beach house property. Charles and Preston have been taking out secret mortgages, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous low register. I scanned the interest rates and the borrowing terms. They are using the beach house as collateral to cover Preston's hemorrhaging real estate projects. Donovan nodded grimly. Charles assumed he owned the house outright after Theodore's death. He bypassed standard title checks by using his old country club banking connections and bribing a private appraiser. They have leveraged over $12 million against a property they do not legally possess. They are using your asset as their personal piggy bank. The pieces of the chessboard fell into perfect, devastating alignment. My family had just thrown me out into the freezing rain, mocking my supposed unemployment. They had drained my college fund years ago to pamper a golden child who was currently drowning in toxic debt. And now they were hosting wealthy Russian investors in my living room, standing on my Persian rugs, drinking my vintage champagne, all while actively committing massive federal bank fraud. They had handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy them. I looked out the tinted window of the Bentley at the glowing windows of the mansion. The silhouette of my brother-in-law strutting past the glass with a drink in his hand made my jaw tighten. I was not just a disgraced daughter anymore. I was their primary creditor. I was their landlord, and their rent was severely past due. My name is Camille, 34 years old, and I spent the entire night wide awake inside my Manhattan apartment, analyzing the explosive financial ledgers Donovan had handed me in the back of his Bentley. The blind trust my grandfather Theodore established 5 years ago was a masterpiece of legal engineering. It made me the sole owner of Vanguard Holdings LLC. By default, it made me the absolute landlord of the $15 million Hamptons beach house my family had just kicked me out of. My father Charles had spent years illegally taking out massive mortgages against a property he did not even own. By dawn, the shock had completely faded, replaced by the cold, calculating precision I used to liquidate failing companies. I had a bulletproof strategy to dismantle their toxic facade piece by piece. The next morning, I arrived at Sterling Heritage Bank in Lower Manhattan. I intentionally dressed down wearing a simple beige cashmere sweater, straight-leg jeans, and comfortable leather loafers. I had $30 million in liquid capital sitting in my account. I no longer needed to wear $10,000 designer suits to prove my worth to anyone. The grand marble lobby of the bank was a quiet, intimidating sanctuary designed exclusively for the ultra-wealthy. Velvet ropes guided the elite toward private suites, and security guards stood at strict attention checking appointments on digital tablets. I walked purposefully toward the VIP teller line to finalize the transfer of my new assets. Before I could even reach the mahogany desk, a sharp, heavily manicured hand grabbed my shoulder and spun me around. I found myself face to face with my mother Beatrice and my sister-in-law Dominique. Dominique looked absolutely immaculate wearing a $5,000 Chanel tweed suit, her hair perfectly blown out, and her wrists dripping in expensive tennis bracelets. As an Ivy League-educated luxury event planner for the elite, she practically radiated arrogance. Beatrice stood right beside her wearing her signature look of wealthy disdain. Dominique immediately stepped into my personal space, her voice intentionally loud enough to turn the heads of nearby investment bankers and wealthy clients. She asked if I was lost or simply applying for a minimum wage loan. She let out a sharp, mocking laugh and announced to the lobby that she heard from my brother Preston about my pathetic situation. She sneered that getting fired and thrown out into the rain must have been a truly humbling experience for someone so stubbornly independent. Beatrice chimed in, crossing her arms tightly over her designer blouse. She told me this specific banking branch required a minimum liquid balance of $5 million just to open a basic checking account. She suggested I take my pitiful cardboard box of office belongings and find a local credit union in a worse neighborhood. My mother proudly declared that family wealth was reserved for those who actually understood how to maintain high society relationships, gesturing grandly to Dominique as the perfect example. Dominique adjusted her diamond bracelet, offering a smile dripping with pure condescension. She announced she was hosting a massive $500,000 charity gala at the beach house this upcoming weekend. She leaned in dangerously close, her expensive floral perfume overwhelming my senses. She told me that since I was an unemployed dropout desperate for cash, maybe she could hire me to scrub the wooden deck of their new yacht. She added that it paid $15 an hour, which was probably more than I was worth. I did not shout. I did not defend my career. I did not shed a single tear. I just looked at the two women who had treated me like disposable garbage my entire life. I offered them a simple, chilling smile that radiated absolute control. Without uttering a single syllable in response, I turned my back on them and walked straight past the regular VIP line. I bypassed the tellers entirely and headed directly for the frosted glass doors of the executive elevator. This was a highly restricted access point reserved exclusively for the bank's institutional owners and top-tier corporate clients. Dominique scoffed loudly behind me, yelling that building security was going to throw me out onto the street for trespassing. Instead of calling for help, I reached into my pocket, pulled out a sleek, solid black keycard, and firmly tapped it against the brass scanner. The light instantly flashed a brilliant green. The heavy frosted glass doors slid open automatically with a soft hum. I stepped inside. The elevator turned around slowly and locked eyes with them. I watched my mother and my sister-in-law stand frozen on the marble floor, their mouths hanging open in absolute breathless shock as the elevator doors glided shut, cutting off their view completely. The elevator whisked me up to the top-floor penthouse executive suite. Marcus, the senior managing director of the bank, stood waiting for me with a freshly brewed espresso and a thick stack of highly confidential financial files. We walked into his corner office, a massive room featuring panoramic windows overlooking the entire Manhattan skyline. Marcus was a man of business and did not waste our time with pleasantries. He pushed a heavy red folder across his polished mahogany desk. He told me that my brother Preston was in catastrophic financial trouble. Preston's luxury real estate development company was currently $12 million in the red. The massive balloon payment on his commercial loan was due today by the close of business, and Preston had absolutely zero liquidity to cover it. Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, and lowered his voice to a serious register. He revealed that Preston was currently sitting in a lower-level office of this very building, sweating, crying, and desperately begging a junior loan officer for a 90-day extension. Marcus explained that Preston wanted to use the Hamptons beach house as collateral to secure the extension. My brother was entirely unaware that the property title legally belonged to Vanguard Holdings LLC, which meant he was trying to leverage a house that legally belonged to me. I picked up the red folder and methodically skimmed through the disastrous financial statements. Preston had recklessly squandered millions of dollars on completely failed investments, constantly relying on our father's arrogant promises and fake wealth to bail him out of trouble. They had built an entire empire of cards on top of a stolen foundation. I closed the folder with a sharp snap and looked Marcus dead in the eye. I told him absolutely not to extend the loan. I instructed him to reject Preston's desperate plea immediately and to initiate default proceedings before the end of the day. Then I leaned back in the plush leather chair and let a dark smirk cross my face. I told Marcus to sell my brother's entire $12 million toxic debt directly to my LLC. I was officially taking control of their ruin. Marcus sat completely still behind his massive mahogany desk processing my command. Taking over $12 million in distressed liabilities was not a standard Tuesday morning transaction even for a bank like Sterling Heritage. I watched his eyes dart from the red financial folder to my face, searching for a sign that I was bluffing. I was not. I pulled out my secure banking tablet, authorized the immediate transfer of $12 million from my $30 million severance, and pushed the glowing confirmation screen across the desk. I told him I was buying my family's debt immediately in full and transferring all creditor rights to Vanguard Holdings LLC. Marcus cleared his throat, his professional demeanor snapping back into place as he realized the sheer magnitude of the capital I was wielding. He tapped his keyboard rapidly, initiating the transfer. He warned me that Preston was currently in the lobby, moments away from total default, and completely unaware that his accounts were being seized by an outside entity. I smiled coldly and told Marcus to let Preston sweat. I instructed him to legally finalize the assignment of debt, making me the sole authority over every single one of Preston's business loans, personal lines of credit, and corporate assets. I owned his company now. I owned his future. While the system processed the massive transaction, Marcus slid a thick stack of archival files across the desk. He explained these were the original loan origination documents Preston submitted 3 years ago for a luxury condo development that completely tanked. He thought I might want to review the historical context of the toxic debt I just purchased. I opened the file and flipped through the heavy parchment pages. The numbers were staggering, reflecting gross mismanagement, exorbitant spending on unearned luxury, and blatant contractor fraud. But it was the final page of the original promissory note that made my blood run ice cold. Right there on the guarantor line was my signature. I stared at the blue ink. It was a near-perfect forgery of my handwriting. 3 years ago, when I was struggling to pay rent in a tiny, unheated studio apartment working 80-hour weeks just to build my career from the ground up, my credit score had mysteriously plummeted. I had been denied basic car loans and apartment applications, completely unable to figure out why my financial identity was ruined. I spent my late 20s fighting a phantom debt I thought was a massive clerical error. I had to eat cheap noodles and walk miles in the snow because I could not even qualify for a subway pass on credit. Now, looking at the bank documents, the brutal truth clicked into place with sickening clarity. Preston had forged my name as a co-signer to secure millions of dollars for his failed real estate project. My father and brother had actively stolen my financial identity, ruined my credit, and watched me struggle to survive all so Preston could buy a yacht and pretend to be a real estate mogul. They knew exactly why I was starving in my 20s, and they sat in their Hamptons mansion drinking champagne while I suffered for their crimes. A sharp, visceral anger flared in my chest, a dark and consuming rage that begged to be unleashed. But I ruthlessly clamped it down. Emotion was a liability. Precision was a weapon. I looked up at Marcus. I pointed to the forged signature and explicitly stated that my brother committed federal wire fraud and identity theft to secure this loan. Marcus turned pale, instantly realizing the legal liability his bank was suddenly exposed to. I raised my hand to stop his panicked apologies. I told him I was not going to sue the bank. I told him I was going to handle Preston myself. I gave Marcus my first official order as Preston's new primary creditor. I instructed him to immediately freeze every single corporate and personal account tied to my brother. I wanted his credit cards declined. I wanted his business lines of credit zeroed out. I wanted his corporate checkbook to become a worthless piece of plastic. Marcus nodded swiftly, typing the override codes into his terminal with shaking hands. Within seconds, Preston was financially paralyzed, sitting just a few floors below me, completely oblivious to the fact that his unemployed sister had just seized his entire life. I stood up, smoothing the front of my cashmere sweater. I thanked Marcus for his exceptional service, took the original forged documents, and slid them securely into my leather tote bag. As I walked out of the executive suite and stepped back into the private elevator, I felt an incredible sense of calm wash over me. The shift in power was absolute. I was no longer the outcast daughter begging for scraps. I was the executioner. My phone vibrated violently in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a notification for the family group chat. It was a message from my mother, Beatrice. I read the words glowing on the screen, her elitist condescension practically dripping from the text. The message read, "Preston is hosting his investors at the gala on Saturday. We fired the catering staff. Come serve drinks. It pays $15 an hour. You need the money." I stood in the silent descending elevator, clutching the forged bank documents that proved my family had deliberately stolen my financial future. I thought about Dominique threatening to make me scrub their yacht just an hour ago. I thought about my father throwing a $100 bill at my feet in the pouring rain. They wanted me to wear a uniform and serve them caviar in a house that I legally owned. They wanted to parade my failure in front of their wealthy friends to make themselves feel powerful. I typed my response with deliberate, steady fingers and hit send. I will be there. The gravel driveway of the Hamptons estate was packed with a fleet of luxury vehicles. Valets in crisp white shirts sprinted through the humid night air, opening doors for Manhattan billionaires and foreign dignitaries. The Saturday night gala was in full swing. Bass from the ballroom echoed across the manicured lawns. I stepped out of my rented sedan and adjusted the collar of my simple black dress. I did not head toward the gravel path leading to the kitchen entrance where the hired help was expected to report. I walked straight up the grand limestone steps toward the towering mahogany front doors. The private security guards recognized me from my eviction earlier that week and moved to block my path. I simply held up the condescending text message from my mother, Beatrice, on my phone, demanding I come serve drinks for $15 an hour. They stepped aside with sneers of pity, fully assuming I was there to scrub glasses and fetch ice for minimum wage. I stepped into the grand foyer. The crystal chandeliers cast a brilliant light over the bustling caterers and elite guests mingling near the coat check. I barely had a moment to take in the sheer excess of the event before a heavy, aggressive hand clamped down hard on my wrist. I turned to see my father, Charles. His face was a mask of barely contained rage. The veins in his neck bulged against his starched tuxedo collar. He leaned in, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and raw panic. He hissed that I was supposed to enter through the back alley like the rest of the disposable hired help. He demanded to know why I was parading through the front doors where his vital Russian investors could see my cheap clothes and associate him with a jobless failure. I did not flinch. I calmly looked down at his hand gripping my wrist and told him to let go before I made a massive scene right in front of his wealthy friends. Charles yanked me forcefully down the side corridor, pushing me past staring waitstaff and bewildered guests. He shoved me into his private soundproof study and slammed the heavy oak door shut, locking it with a sharp click. The sudden silence in the room was deafening. He marched over to his massive executive desk, picked up a thick stack of legal papers, and slammed them down right in front of me. He threw a gold-plated pen on top of the stack with a loud clatter. Charles ordered me to sign the document immediately. He paced behind his desk like a trapped, desperate animal. He told me it was just a standard legal waiver, a minor formality required by his attorneys to close out a lingering account. He claimed it was a document officially surrendering my meaningless 1% residual rights to my grandfather Theodore's old holding company. He pulled a fresh stack of $100 bills from his drawer and tossed them next to the pen. He told me there was $1,000 in cash for my trouble. He sneered that $1,000 was probably more money than I had seen in months. He commanded me to sign the bottom line and take the cash, or he would have his security team physically drag me back out into the rain and ban me from the property forever. This was exactly how Charles had operated my entire life. He relied on fierce intimidation, cheap financial bribery, and the arrogant assumption that everyone around him was too stupid to question his absolute authority. When I was 19, he tried to bribe me with a broken-down used car if I agreed to drop out of my university economics program and work as a receptionist for Preston's doomed tech startup. When I refused to sacrifice my education for my brother's ego, Charles completely cut off my health insurance and canceled my meal plan. He always treated me like a nuisance that could be swatted away with a few crumpled bills and a harsh threat. He fully expected me to blindly sign a complex legal document just to escape his yelling and secure a meager payout. He genuinely believed his own daughter, a senior corporate strategist, would not read the fine print. I picked up the document. I ignored the signature line at the bottom and flipped straight to the second page. My eyes scanned the dense legal jargon, bypassing the standard indemnity clauses to find the exact structure of the agreement. It took my professionally trained eyes less than 10 seconds to realize Charles was lying through his teeth. This was not a residual waiver, it was a complete transfer of deed. The paperwork was drafted to legally authorize the immediate sale of Vanguard Holdings LLC, the exact holding company I now completely owned. I flipped to the third page and read the buyer information. Charles was not just selling the company, he was attempting to illegally sell the very beach house we were currently standing in. The listed buyer was an offshore shell syndicate registered in the Cayman Islands, linked directly to the Russian investors, currently drinking champagne in the ballroom. He was liquidating the stolen property tonight for a massive, untraceable cash buyout. The urgency, the panic, the gala itself, it all made perfect, terrifying sense. Charles was trying to close a multi-million-dollar black market real estate deal in the middle of a party to desperately cover Preston's $12 million corporate bankruptcy before the banks officially foreclosed on Monday morning. He needed my forged signature to clear a lingering title discrepancy he had just discovered. He was actively attempting to commit massive international wire fraud, and he wanted me to be his unwitting accomplice to take the fall. I looked at the gold pen, then up at my father's sweating, panicked face. The trap was set, but he had no idea he was the one standing right in the middle of it. I let my hands start to tremble. It was a calculated, deliberate shift in my physical demeanor, instantly reverting to the pathetic, broken daughter my father had always perceived me to be. I dropped the forged document back onto the desk and clutched at my chest, forcing my breathing to become shallow and ragged. I let my eyes widen with manufactured terror, staring at Charles, as if the sheer pressure of his presence was physically crushing me. I stumbled backward, my shoulders hitting the leather spine of a guest chair, and let out a sharp gasp. I told him my chest was tight, that the legal jargon was blurring together, and that I was having a massive panic attack. Charles stared at me with unadulterated disgust, his lip curled, revealing his perfectly capped teeth, repulsed by the sudden display of weakness. He sneered, calling me a fragile, useless child who could not even handle a simple business transaction without falling apart. I leaned heavily against his desk, gripping the edge until my knuckles turned white, and begged him for a glass of water. I choked out that I just needed a single moment to calm my nerves before I could hold the pen steady enough to sign anything. Rolling his eyes, Charles turned his back to me and marched toward the crystal decanters on his private bar cart across the room. The second his eyes were off me, my trembling stopped completely. With absolute precision, I swept my arm across the mahogany desk, knocking the gold-plated pen onto the floor. I dove down onto the thick Persian rug, pretending to scramble after it. While hidden beneath the heavy wooden overhang of the desk, I reached into the hidden seam of my leather tote bag. I retrieved a matte black micro-transmitter, no larger than a dime, and pressed the adhesive backing firmly against the underside of his desk drawer. I grabbed the pen, pulled myself back up, and instantly resumed my hyperventilating, just as Charles turned around holding a glass of ice water. He shoved the cold glass into my hands, spilling water onto my wrists, and demanded I sign the paper immediately so he could return to his guests. I took a shaky sip, letting a few drops spill down my chin to sell the performance. I looked up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes and told him I could not do it right now. I begged for exactly 1 hour to sit in the quiet study, drink my water, and read the document properly. I promised him that once my heart stopped racing, I would sign whatever he wanted. Charles checked his gold Rolex, his jaw clenching with furious impatience. He calculated his options. If he forced my hand physically, the signature would look erratic, potentially flagging the offshore escrow agents. He needed a clean, perfectly legible signature to finalize the massive wire transfer. He pointed a thick manicured finger at my face and told me I had exactly 60 minutes to get my pathetic emotions under control. He declared that if the signed document was not sitting on his desk when he returned, he would have me thrown out of the estate with absolutely nothing. Without waiting for my response, he stormed out of the room. The heavy oak door slammed shut, followed instantly by the sharp, metallic click of the deadbolt locking from the outside. I set the water glass down on a coaster. My posture straightened instantly, the fragile facade dissolving entirely into cold, focused energy. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a small wireless earpiece, and slipped it into my right ear. I tapped the side of the device to sync it with the transmitter I had just planted. Immediately, the crisp, high-definition audio of the hallway flooded into my ear. I heard the heavy, anxious pacing of designer shoes on hardwood. Preston was waiting right outside the door. His voice cracked with raw panic as he ambushed our father. He demanded to know if I had signed the deed transfer, his breathing just as erratic as the panic attack I had just faked. Charles snapped at him to lower his voice, his tone venomous. He told Preston that the hysterical little girl was having a breakdown and needed an hour to calm her nerves before she would put pen to paper. Preston let out a pathetic, high-pitched whine that echoed perfectly through my earpiece. He told Charles they did not have an hour. He stammered that the Russian syndicate representatives were already growing incredibly impatient in the VIP lounge upstairs. Preston hissed that if I did not sign that transfer tonight, the Russians would kill the deal completely. He sobbed that his entire luxury real estate firm would go under on Monday morning, the bank would seize everything, and he would be facing federal prison for criminal negligence. Charles grabbed him by the lapels, the sound of rustling fabric crystal clear over the transmission. He ordered his son to go back upstairs, pour the Russians more champagne, and keep them entertained. Charles promised he would wring the signature out of me the second the hour was up. The heavy footsteps faded as both men retreated toward the grand ballroom. I pulled the earpiece out and let a slow, satisfied smile cross my face. They thought they had locked a helpless, terrified victim inside a cage. They forgot that I spent the first 5 years after Charles kicked me out living in dilapidated, dangerous neighborhoods where survival meant learning how to bypass locked doors. I reached into the inner lining of my tote bag and pulled out a sleek titanium lock-picking kit. I walked over to the heavy oak door and slid the tension wrench into the brass keyhole, followed smoothly by a standard hook pick. I applied gentle pressure, feeling the pins inside the expensive cylinder click into place one by one. The mechanism was surprisingly simple, a generic luxury lock designed for privacy, not actual high-level security. It took me less than 40 seconds. The final pin dropped, the cylinder rotated, and the deadbolt slid back with a soft, heavy thud. I opened the door and stepped out of the study. I smoothed my black dress, adjusted my posture into a stance of absolute authority, and walked purposefully down the corridor. I bypassed the bewildered security guards and stepped directly into the blinding light and deafening music of the main ballroom, fully ready to dismantle my family's empire in front of every single elite guest they had invited. I did not step onto the main floor looking like a defeated runaway. Instead, I ducked into the opulent marble powder room just off the corridor. My oversized leather tote bag held more than just lock-picking tools and forged bank documents. I unzipped the bottom compartment and pulled out a vacuum-sealed travel bag. Inside was my armor. It was a breathtaking custom emerald green Oscar de la Renta gown I had purchased in Paris 3 years ago to celebrate my first million, completely hidden from my family's judging eyes. I stripped off the simple black dress, slipped into the cool, heavy silk of the gown, and pinned my hair into a sharp, elegant twist. I applied a slash of crimson lipstick, stashed my tote behind a decorative urn, and finally stepped directly into the blinding light and deafening music of the main ballroom. The Hamptons Gala, was a masterclass in aggressive wealth and desperate posturing. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured prisms of light across the expansive room. Waitstaff in crisp white tuxedos glided past towering ice sculptures, carrying trays of beluga caviar and vintage champagne. I recognized several high-profile Manhattan real estate developers, local politicians, and a cluster of stern-faced men in the VIP section who were undoubtedly Charles's Russian syndicate buyers. They were the men my father and brother were currently attempting to defraud with my forged signature. I walked down the grand staircase, letting the heavy silk of my gown trail perfectly behind me. The emerald fabric caught the chandelier light, radiating pure, unapologetic power. Conversations began to falter as I passed, heads turned, glasses lowered. I was no longer the disgraced daughter cast out into the rain. I looked like I owned the room, and the irony was that as of this morning, I legally did. It did not take long for the family guard dog to spot me. Dominique was holding court near the grand fireplace, laughing loudly at a joke made by a wealthy socialite. She wore her signature Chanel tweed, looking perfectly polished. When her eyes locked onto mine, the fake smile slid off her face, replaced by a mask of absolute, unadulterated fury. She had expected to see me carrying a tray of dirty glasses in a cheap polyester uniform. Instead, she was staring at a woman wearing a dress that cost twice her monthly event planning salary. Dominique excused herself from her circle and marched toward me like a heat-seeking missile. I watched her hand snatch a full glass of deep red Merlot from a passing waiter's tray. Her knuckles were white. Her intentions were entirely transparent. I remembered this exact tactic from Preston's graduation party 6 years ago, when she intentionally ruined my only decent silk blouse just moments before the family photos, claiming she tripped over a rug. She loved to use clumsiness as a weapon to humiliate me in public. She accelerated as she approached, lifting the glass slightly, aiming directly for the center of my chest. She faked a sudden stumble, throwing her weight forward to launch the dark red liquid at my $10,000 gown. I did not flinch. I did not gasp. I simply took one fluid, perfectly timed step to the right. Dominique lurched forward, grasping at empty air. The entire glass of red wine sailed past me and crashed violently onto the floor. The dark liquid exploded outward, instantly soaking into the fibers of Beatrice's prized 200-year-old Persian rug. The sound of shattering crystal echoed sharply over the string quartet, drawing the eyes of dozens of wealthy guests. Dominique stumbled, barely catching herself on a cocktail table before she fell entirely. Her face burned crimson, matching the spreading stain on the antique carpet beneath her heels. "Are you blind?" she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper aimed only at me, while she frantically tried to smile for the staring guests. "You look like a cheap escort. I told you to go to the servants' entrance. Get into the kitchen before I have security throw you out by your hair." I looked down at the ruined rug, then back up to her panicked, furious eyes. I smoothed a non-existent wrinkle from my gown and offered a chilling, relaxed smile. "Careful, Dominique," I replied evenly. "You are spilling cheap wine on my expensive floor." She scoffed a desperate, ugly sound, adjusting her diamond tennis bracelets. She leaned in the heavy scent of her floral perfume, failing to mask the sour smell of her anxiety. "Your floor. You are an unemployed dropout squatting at our party. You are nothing." Before she could spit another insult, a sudden shift in the crowd's energy caught my attention. The sea of tuxedos parted naturally, making way for a man who did not care about black-tie dress codes. Julian Vance, the notoriously reclusive tech billionaire and founder of Apex Innovations, strolled through the ballroom, wearing a perfectly tailored navy blazer over a simple black t-shirt. He was a titan in the venture capital world, a man whose single investment could make or break an entire corporate empire. Dominique instantly recognized him. I watched the anger vanish from her face, replaced by a hungry, desperate ambition. Her luxury event planning business was failing, and a single networking connection with Julian Vance could save her sinking reputation. She hastily wiped a drop of spilled wine from her hand, plastered on a brilliant, charming smile, and stepped directly into his path. "Mr. Vance," Dominique cooed, extending her manicured hand. "I am Dominique Vanguard. I orchestrated tonight's gala. It is an absolute honor to have you." Julian did not even break his stride. He looked right through Dominique as if she were a ghost, completely ignoring her extended hand. He bypassed her so closely that his shoulder brushed against her Chanel suit, leaving her standing frozen with her hands suspended in empty air. His eyes locked onto me, and his serious expression instantly broke into a massive, genuine grin. "Camille!" Julian shouted, his booming voice cutting through the ambient noise of the ballroom. He walked straight up to me and wrapped me in a tight, familiar hug, patting me firmly on the back. He pulled away, holding me by the shoulders, beaming with absolute admiration. "The brilliant strategist herself," Julian announced, his voice carrying clearly to the surrounding crowd. "I just heard the news from the board. A $30 million exit liquidating Vanguard's toxic assets. You are an absolute shark, Camille. I knew you were the smartest person in that firm." I smiled back at him, feeling the satisfying weight of the moment. Behind Julian, I watched Dominique slowly lower her rejected hand. The blood had entirely drained from her face. She stood paralyzed on the ruined Persian rug, her mouth hanging open in absolute breathless shock, as the reality of Julian's words struck her. The unemployed failure she had just tried to humiliate was being praised as a multimillionaire by one of the most powerful men in the room. The silence radiating from Dominique was absolute. Julian Vance released my shoulders, entirely oblivious to the monumental family dynamic he had just shattered. He gestured grandly toward the bar, asking if I wanted to grab a scotch, and discuss how I managed to dismantle my last corporate acquisition with such ruthless precision. Before I could accept his offer, a sharp, frantic voice cut through the murmurs of the surrounding guests. My brother Preston shoved his way past a pair of startled socialites. He wore a bespoke velvet dinner jacket, his hair perfectly coiffed, projecting the exact image of a wealthy, untouchable real estate magnate. But his eyes were wild with panic. He had seen Julian embrace me from across the ballroom and rushed over to perform immediate damage control. He could not allow his disgraced, supposedly unemployed sister to ruin his networking opportunities with a man who could fund his entire failing company with pocket change. Preston inserted himself directly between Julian and me. He forced a wide, incredibly fake laugh and aggressively extended his hand toward the billionaire. He introduced himself loudly, making sure the nearby Russian investors could hear the Vanguard name. He told Julian there had clearly been a massive misunderstanding. He flashed a condescending smile in my direction and announced to the elite crowd that I was just his deeply troubled sister. He claimed I was currently unemployed, struggling with severe mental health issues, and certainly not the architect of any multi-million-dollar financial exit. He actually reached out to pat my arm in a show of fake brotherly concern, suggesting Julian had confused me with someone relevant. Julian did not take Preston's outstretched hand. He looked at my brother as if he had just scraped him off the bottom of his shoe. Julian tilted his head, his sharp intellect instantly categorizing Preston as a lightweight. He bluntly told my brother that he never forgot a face, especially not the face of the woman who just orchestrated the most brutal corporate liquidation Wall Street had seen all quarter. Julian laughed dryly, stating that if Preston actually believed I was unemployed, then Preston was the most financially illiterate developer in Manhattan. The blood rushed to Preston's face. He opened his mouth to argue, to double down on the lie, but I did not give him the chance. It was time to systematically dismantle the golden child. I stepped around Julian and closed the distance between Preston and myself. I looked him up and down, letting my eyes settle deliberately on his left wrist. The cuff of his velvet jacket had slipped back, revealing a gleaming heavy gold timepiece. I smiled warmly. I asked him if that was the new Patek Philippe Grand Complications watch he had purchased last week. I noted the retail value was roughly $150,000. Preston puffed out his chest, adjusting his cuff to show off the watch even more. He bragged that it was a custom order, a small reward to himself for closing a major development phase. He sneered that it was an investment piece, something someone in my pathetic tax bracket would never understand. I nodded slowly, letting the silence stretch for a beat. Then I raised my voice just enough for the surrounding guests, including his Russian buyers standing near the ice sculptures, to hear every single syllable. I told him it was an incredibly interesting purchase for a man whose corporate accounts were entirely frozen by his primary creditor at 9 o'clock this morning. The air in the ballroom seemed to instantly evaporate. The string quartet continued playing in the corner, but the guests standing within 20 feet of us went completely still. Julian crossed his arms, an amused smirk playing on his lips as he watched the execution unfold. Preston's arrogant smile vanished. His jaw went slack. He barked that I was insane, demanding to know what kind of delusional garbage I was spewing in front of his guests. He tried to lower his voice, hissing at me to shut my mouth and get back to the kitchen before he had security drag me out by my hair. I did not lower my voice. I stepped closer, my tone dropping to a chilling clinical register. I detailed his exact financial ruin. I told him his luxury condo project was currently $12 million in the red. I revealed that his commercial balloon payment had bounced due to insufficient funds. I explained that his corporate lines of credit had been zeroed out, his company checkbook was entirely worthless, and his personal credit cards would currently decline a cup of coffee. I looked him dead in the eye and stated that he was completely, irrevocably bankrupt. Dominique gasped loudly from her spot on the ruined rug. She rushed over, grabbing Preston's arm, desperately demanding to know if what I was saying was true. She hissed that they had just booked a $200,000 vacation to St. Bart's on their corporate card. She grabbed his lapel, demanding he fix this embarrassment immediately. Preston shoved her hand away, his chest heaving with panic. He looked around wildly, seeing the wealthy investors he was trying to defraud, actively listening to every word. The Russian syndicate members were exchanging dark, calculated whispers. He pointed a shaking finger at my face and yelled that his bank had assured him a 90-day extension was being processed. He claimed his accounts were perfectly fine and that I was just a jealous, lying sociopath trying to ruin his reputation because our father loved him more. Right on cue, Preston's tuxedo pocket began to vibrate. The sharp buzzing cut through the heavy tension of the standoff. Preston froze. He slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The caller ID flashed brightly on the screen. It was his chief financial officer. I gestured gracefully toward the device. I told him he should probably answer that as his CFO likely had some pressing updates regarding his 90-day extension and the sudden termination of all his corporate funds. Preston swiped the screen with a trembling thumb and lifted the phone to his ear. He did not say a word. He just stood there listening to the frantic voice of his accountant bleeding through the receiver. The voice was loud enough for Dominique to hear the panicked shouting about zero balances and locked asset portfolios. I watched the color drain from Preston's face in real time. His tan complexion turned a sickly ash gray. His eyes widened in absolute terror as the reality of his total financial destruction was confirmed over the line. His knees physically buckled, and he had to grab the edge of a nearby cocktail table just to keep from collapsing onto the marble floor. The phone slipped from his loose grip and clattered loudly against the floor, the screen cracking upon impact. He did not look at Julian. He did not look at his wife, who was now clutching her Chanel jacket in horror. He slowly turned his head and locked eyes with me. He was breathless, completely stripped of the arrogant armor he had worn his entire life. His voice shook as he asked the only question that mattered. Who bought our debt? I held his terrified gaze. I did not blink. I told him that Vanguard Holdings, LLC, had purchased his toxic debt bundle at exactly 9:15 this morning for pennies on the dollar. I informed him that I was now his primary creditor, his landlord, and the sole owner of his ruined corporate legacy. Before Preston could even process the sheer magnitude of his defeat, a sudden shift in the crowd parted the sea of guests once again. 4 men in impeccably tailored charcoal suits moved with synchronized predatory purpose. They bypassed the champagne flutes, ignored the desperate networking attempts of local politicians, and marched directly toward our fractured family circle. At their center was Victor, the head of the Russian syndicate. His face was a slab of granite, entirely unbothered by the opulence surrounding him. He had not come for caviar or polite conversation. He had come for his untraceable real estate asset. Charles materialized from the crowd, sprinting toward the men with a frantic, sweating desperation. He forced a wide, overly enthusiastic smile, extending both hands toward Victor. He practically tripped over Beatrice's ruined Persian rug, babbling about the wonderful turnout and offering them a private, exclusive tour of the wine cellar to discuss their future partnerships. Victor did not take Charles's hands. He stopped dead in his tracks, his cold, dead eyes locking onto my father. He spoke with a thick, heavy accent that carried effortlessly over the string quartet playing in the corner. He stated that they were not here to drink wine. He told Charles that his associates had grown entirely tired of waiting in the upstairs VIP lounge while Charles played host. Victor checked his heavy platinum watch and issued his final uncompromising ultimatum. He said the offshore wire transfer was queued and ready, but his patience was completely gone. He demanded that they sign the deed for the beach house right now, or they would walk out the front doors and take their millions elsewhere. Charles turned an ashen shade of white. The golden goose was actively walking away. His eyes darted frantically around the room, landing first on Preston, who was currently hyperventilating against a cocktail table, and then finally locking onto me. For a split second, Charles registered the custom Oscar de la Renta gown I was wearing. He registered Julian Vance standing at my side with an amused, dangerous smirk. But Charles was too blinded by the impending collapse of his black market deal to process the blatant warning signs. Panic completely overrode his logic and his manners. Charles lunged toward me. He abandoned all pretense of being a dignified host. His heavy, sweating hand clamped down onto my bare arm with vicious, bruising force. His grip was entirely different from the condescending grab in the foyer earlier that evening. This was the grip of a drowning man trying to pull someone else under the water with him. His nails dug into my skin as he forcefully yanked me toward the corridor leading back to the soundproof study. He leaned in close, his breath hot and reeking of scotch and pure fear. He hissed through clenched teeth, ignoring the fact that half of New York high society was actively watching him assault his own daughter. He commanded me to get back into the study immediately. He demanded I stop playing these pathetic dress-up games, pick up the gold pen, and sign the deed transfer right that second. He swore that if I humiliated him in front of his vital investors and cost him this buyout, he would destroy me. He spit out his final desperate threat, telling me to sign the waiver now or I was dead to this family. The music in the ballroom seemed to fade into a dull hum. The clinking of crystal glasses ceased entirely. Everyone from the hired caterers to the Russian syndicate watched the patriarch of the Vanguard Empire lose his mind in the middle of his own gala. I looked down at his hand gripping my arm. I felt the sharp sting of his nails, the sheer entitlement radiating from his desperate grip. For my entire life, I had shrunk away from that grip. I had bowed my head, accepted the scraps they threw at me, and allowed them to dictate my absolute worth. Not tonight. I planted my heels firmly onto the polished marble floor. I twisted my shoulders sharply, applying tactical leverage against his thumb, and violently ripped my arm out of his grasp. The sudden, forceful movement caught Charles completely off guard. He stumbled forward, his heavy frame pitching awkwardly as he grasped at empty air to keep from falling onto the ruined rug alongside Dominique. I smoothed the silk of my gown completely unbothered by his stumbling. I looked at my father, taking in his red, sweating face, his bulging veins, his absolute pathetic desperation. I told him he was making a massive scene in front of his very important guests. I reminded him that I owned Vanguard Holdings, which meant I legally owned this very estate, the ground he was currently standing on, and the exact deed he was trying to illegally sell to foreign criminals. Charles gaped at me like a fish out of water. He stammered, unable to string a coherent sentence together, as the reality of my words finally began to penetrate his thick, arrogant skull. He looked back at Victor, who was now watching the exchange with dark, calculating suspicion. Charles tried to speak, tried to spin another brilliant lie to save his skin, but I cut him off entirely. I took a step closer, forcing him to look me dead in the eye. I told him I gladly accepted his terms. I announced that I was officially dead to this family. I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out my smartphone. The screen was already glowing brightly, displaying a highly encrypted file transfer portal, synced directly to the microtransmitter I had planted under his desk. The progress bar was flashing, loaded with the pristine audio recording of Charles and Preston, actively discussing their international wire fraud and their attempts to forge documents just minutes ago. I held the phone up so Charles could clearly read the exact destination address of the data transfer. I smiled, a cold, predatory expression that finally made my father step back in genuine terror. I told him I was dead to this family, but I was very much alive to the Internal Revenue Service. Without breaking eye contact, I pressed the send button. I watched the progress bar hit 100%. A tiny green checkmark flashed across my screen. The encrypted audio file containing Charles and Preston detailing their international wire fraud was officially in the hands of the Internal Revenue Service and my personal legal team. Charles stared at the green checkmark, his brain completely short-circuiting. The realization that his own daughter had just handed the federal government the exact audio evidence needed to lock him away for a decade hit him like a physical blow. He let out a guttural, animalistic sound and lunged for my phone. I smoothly stepped back, dropping the device back into my clutch. Julian Vance moved effortlessly, placing his broad shoulder between Charles and me. Julian gave Charles a look of absolute ice, silently daring the older man to try and push past a billionaire with his own private security team waiting in the wings. Victor stepped forward, his patience entirely evaporated. He signaled to his three massive associates. The men moved in perfect synchronization surrounding Charles and effectively trapping him between the Russian syndicate and Julian Vance. Victor demanded an explanation. He demanded the deed to the beach house. He demanded his money back immediately if the property was not secured within the next 60 seconds. Charles stammered, sweating profusely, trying to promise Victor that the deed was secure, that I was just a hysterical liar, and that the transaction would go through exactly as planned. He did not get the chance to finish his desperate pitch. The massive brass-handled oak doors at the back of the grand ballroom swung open with a violent crash. The heavy wood slammed against the limestone walls, the sound echoing like a gunshot over the chatter of the elite guests. The string quartet instantly stopped playing. The sudden, deafening silence in the room was heavier than the music had been. Every head turned toward the entryway. Waiters froze with trays of champagne suspended in the air. The high society guests parted instinctively, sensing an entirely different kind of power entering the room. Arthur Donovan strode into the ballroom. He was my grandfather Theodore's most trusted estate attorney, a man known throughout Manhattan for his ruthless precision and absolute lack of mercy. He wore a sharp custom charcoal suit, gripping a thick leather briefcase in his right hand. He was not alone. Flanking him on either side were two massive private security contractors dressed in tactical black, their hands resting comfortably near their holsters. They moved with military precision, parting the sea of shocked billionaires and socialites without uttering a single word. Dominique let out a sharp gasp, scrambling backward against the bar to get out of their way. Preston, still hyperventilating from his CFOS call, slid down the wall and put his head between his knees, utterly defeated by the sight of the family attorney. He knew exactly what Donovan represented. Charles visibly panicked. He tried to puff up his chest, projecting a false sense of authority, and marched toward Donovan. He demanded to know what the attorney was doing at a private gala. He screamed that Donovan had absolutely no jurisdiction here and ordered his own estate security guards to throw the attorney out into the rain. Donovan ignored Charles completely. He walked right past my sweating, furious father, as if he were a piece of cheap furniture. The two armed guards stepped neatly in front of Charles, crossing their arms and physically blocking him from following. Donovan marched straight up to the cluster of Russian investors. He stopped in front of Victor, his posture rigid and commanding. Donovan looked Victor directly in the eye. He announced loudly, ensuring his voice carried to every corner of the silent ballroom, that he was the primary executor of the Theodore Vanguard estate. Donovan gestured toward Charles with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Gentlemen, Charles cannot sell you this property." Donovan stated, his voice ringing with absolute legal authority. "Any signature he provides you tonight is fraudulent." Victor narrowed his eyes, his gaze darting from Donovan to Charles and finally to me. The Russian syndicate leader was a dangerous man, but he was not a stupid one. He instantly recognized a compromised asset. Victor took a deliberate step back from Charles, signaling his men to stand down. He looked at Donovan and told the attorney he was listening. Charles lost whatever shred of sanity he had left. The veins in his forehead throbbed dangerously against his pale skin. He shoved against one of the private security guards, spittle flying from his lips as he screamed across the room. He bellowed that Donovan was a liar and a traitor. He pointed a shaking finger at the high vaulted ceiling of the ballroom and roared that he was Theodore Vanguard's only son. He claimed this was his birthright. He screamed that he inherited this entire estate, that his name was on the charter, and that he had the absolute, undeniable legal authority to liquidate any property he saw fit. My father pounded his fist against his own chest, declaring that Vanguard Holdings was his empire. He turned his furious gaze toward me, pointing directly at my face. He yelled to the crowd that I was a deceitful, jealous child trying to steal his legacy because I was angry about being left out of the family business. He demanded that Victor ignore the attorney, promising the Russians that he would forge the documents himself if he had to. Donovan did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He calmly popped the brass latches on his leather briefcase. The sharp clicks echoed perfectly in the dead silent room. He reached inside and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bound with a heavy blue seal. He held the paperwork up so Charles Victor and every single guest in the front row could clearly see the official crest of the state of New York. Donovan looked at Charles with a mixture of pity and supreme professional disgust. He informed my father that Theodore had never trusted him with the family legacy. Donovan explained that Theodore knew Charles was financially reckless, arrogant, and entirely capable of running the Vanguard empire into the ground to feed his own ego. Theodore put this estate into a blind trust 5 years ago. Donovan announced, his words cutting through the air like a scalpel. He legally transferred the deed to this house and the entirety of the corporate assets directly into Vanguard Holdings, LLC. The silence that followed Donovan's declaration was absolute. The clinking of crystal champagne flutes, the hushed whispers of the Hamptons elite, and even the ambient hum of the caterers moving in the adjacent kitchen seemed to vanish entirely. Charles stared at the heavy blue-sealed document in the attorney's hand, as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but no sound came out. The sheer impossibility of what he was hearing had completely short-circuited his brain. He had spent the last 5 years acting as the undisputed king of the Vanguard Empire, recklessly liquidating assets, borrowing heavily against prime properties, and blindly funding Preston's doomed corporate ventures. The idea that he had been playing with monopoly money that he never actually owned. The board he was standing on was utterly incomprehensible to his arrogant, entitled mind. It was my mother Beatrice who finally broke the suffocating silence. She pushed her way aggressively through the crowd of stunned socialites, her heavy diamond necklaces catching the chandelier light with every frantic movement. Her perfectly lifted face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated outrage. The poised, elegant hostess she had been playing all evening completely shattered. She pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at Donovan, entirely ignoring the 2 armed security contractors standing between them. She shrieked that this was a massive mistake, a clerical error, or a sick, twisted joke. She yelled that Theodore would never bypass his own son for the family legacy. Her voice reached a hysterical, echoing pitch that bounced off the vaulted ceilings of the ballroom. She screamed, "Who the hell owns Vanguard LLC?" I did not wait for the attorney to answer her. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, moving past Julian Vance and placing myself directly in the center of the polished marble floor. The emerald silk of my custom gown flowed around me, commanding the unwavering attention of every single billionaire politician and investor in the room. I looked directly into my mother's wide, panicked eyes. I kept my voice perfectly level, letting the pristine acoustics of the grand ballroom carry my words to the furthest corners of the estate. "I do," I said. I reached into my designer clutch and retrieved the heavy folded parchment I had secured from the offshore holding company earlier that week. I walked over to the nearest cocktail table, brushing past a paralyzed waiter, and slammed the master deed down onto the glass surface. The sharp smack echoed like a gavel striking a wooden block, finalizing their complete destruction. I looked at my mother, then at my father, and finally at my brother Preston, who was still slumped against the far wall in a state of catatonic shock. "Welcome to my house," I stated. Beatrice let out a strangled gasp, clutching her chest, as if she had been physically struck. Charles finally found his voice, letting out a weak, pathetic sputter of denial. He lunged toward the cocktail table, desperate to read the fine print of the document, but Donovan's private security contractors instantly stepped in his path. They crossed their massive arms, forming an impenetrable human wall of black tactical gear. Donovan adjusted his suit jacket and confirmed my statement to the entire room. The attorney explained, his tone laced with immense professional satisfaction, that Theodore had watched Charles and Preston mismanage company funds for years before his death. Theodore knew his son and grandson were driven by blind ego and bottomless greed, entirely devoid of any real business acumen. He saw that I, the daughter they had repeatedly cast aside, verbally abused and belittled, was the only person with the strategic brilliance required to protect the family legacy from total ruin. Theodore had quietly transferred the controlling shares to a blind trust, deliberately programmed to activate the exact moment Charles attempted to illegally liquidate the primary estate. Charles had triggered his own absolute downfall by trying to sell the property tonight. The high society crowd erupted into a frenzy of scandalous whispers. Cell phones were discreetly pulled out from tuxedo pockets and designer clutches as New York's elite began rapidly texting the catastrophic fallout of the Vanguard Empire to everyone they knew in the financial district. But the wealthy gossips did not matter to Charles right now. The only thing that mattered was the imposing, terrifying presence of Victor and his three massive associates. Victor stepped forward, his heavy, expensive shoes clicking menacingly on the marble floor. He did not look at me, and he did not look at Donovan. His cold, dead eyes were locked entirely on my father. The Russian syndicate leader realized exactly what had just transpired. He had been minutes away from signing a multi-million-dollar wire transfer for a property the seller did not even legally own. Victor's voice was a low, lethal rumble that instantly silenced the gossiping crowd around them. He stepped directly into Charles's personal space, towering over my sweating, trembling father. He asked with deadly restrained anger, "You tried to sell us stolen property." Charles shrank back, raising his hands in a pathetic, trembling gesture of surrender. He babbled incoherently, sweat pouring down his face and completely soaking the starched collar of his tuxedo. He promised Victor it was just a simple misunderstanding, a minor family dispute over paperwork that he would rectify immediately. He begged for just 24 hours to clear the title discrepancy with the local courts, swearing that the beach house would still be theirs. Victor did not care about family disputes. He did not care about Charles's desperate excuses. He grabbed Charles by the lapels of his tuxedo, lifting him slightly off the floor. Victor stated that his syndicate had already wired a $5 million good-faith deposit into Preston's corporate escrow account earlier that afternoon to secure the exclusive buying rights for the property. It was the exact $5 million Preston had desperately needed to temporarily appease his primary creditors before the rest of the fraudulent sale went through. Victor dropped Charles, letting my father stumble backward awkwardly onto the ruined Persian rug. The syndicate leader adjusted his suit cuffs with chilling, terrifying calm. He told Charles that the real estate deal was entirely dead. He issued a final absolute command. He demanded their $5 million deposit back immediately. The silence in the room was absolute following Victor's demand. The clinking of crystal champagne flutes, the hushed whispers of the Hamptons elite, and even the ambient hum of the catering staff in the adjacent kitchens seemed to vanish entirely. Charles stared at the Russian syndicate leader as if a trapdoor had just opened beneath his feet. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but no sound came out. The sheer impossibility of his situation had completely short-circuited his brain. He had spent the last 5 years acting as the undisputed king of the Vanguard Empire, recklessly liquidating assets, borrowing heavily against prime properties, and blindly funding his son's doomed corporate ventures. The idea that he had to immediately produce $5 million in liquid cash was a mathematical impossibility. The blood completely drained from my father's face, leaving his skin a sickly translucent gray. He finally stammered, his voice cracking under the crushing weight of his own hubris. He confessed to Victor that the money was gone. He frantically explained that the offshore wire transfer had bypassed the standard holding protocols because they needed the capital immediately. He admitted, his voice dropping to a pathetic, trembling whimper, that he had already spent the entire $5 million deposit to pay off Preston's aggressive construction vendors. He had desperately drained the escrow account just to keep the Vanguard commercial real estate projects from defaulting before sunrise. The collective gasp from the high society crowd was deafening. The Vanguard patriarch, a man who had built his entire reputation on the illusion of infinite wealth, had just admitted to defrauding a highly dangerous foreign syndicate to cover his son's toxic debts. Victor did not shout. He did not curse. He simply tilted his head, his eyes narrowing into dark, lethal slits. He subtly signaled his men, who simultaneously unbuttoned their charcoal suit jackets, revealing the distinct heavy bulges of shoulder holsters. The threat was no longer implied, it was immediate and physical. This was the exact moment the rats decided to flee the sinking ship. Dominique, who had spent the last hour hyperventilating near the ice sculptures, suddenly found her voice. She scrambled away from her husband Preston, her expensive designer heels slipping wildly on the spilled champagne, covering the marble floor. She shoved her way toward the center of the room, positioning herself as far away from the vanguard men as physically possible. She smoothed down her ruined silk dress and threw her chin up, desperately attempting to salvage the only thing she actually cared about: her elite social standing among the Manhattan wives. She pointed an accusing manicured finger directly at Charles and Preston. She shrieked that she had absolutely nothing to do with this financial disaster. She shouted to the stunned crowd of socialites and investors that she was completely innocent. She declared loudly that her luxury event planning company was an entirely separate financial entity, completely insulated from Vanguard Holdings and their toxic ledgers. She swore to the audience, and specifically to Victor, that she was just another victim of their reckless, illegal schemes. She threw her own husband under the bus without a single second of hesitation, claiming Preston had lied to her about their bank accounts for months. I watched her perform this pathetic, desperate theater. I watched her try to sever ties with the very men she had actively conspired with just an hour prior. It was time to initiate the final sequence. I held my phone in my hand, the screen still glowing from the encrypted file transfer I had successfully routed to the authorities. But I had strategically retained a local copy of the raw audio file. I accessed the control panel for the estate's smart home network. As the newly established legal owner of Vanguard Holdings and all its corresponding assets, my digital credentials had automatically overridden Charles's administrative access. I synced my device directly to the ballroom's state-of-the-art surround sound Bluetooth speakers. I looked at Dominique, who was still loudly proclaiming her innocence to a group of horrified hedge fund managers. I tapped the play button on my screen. The crystal-clear audio from the soundproof study blasted through the hidden speakers, echoing off the vaulted ceilings and drowning out the panicked murmurs of the crowd. Every single guest in the Hamptons' high society heard my father's voice, first aggressive and frantic. Then came Preston's voice, whining about the frozen corporate accounts and the impending audits. But the crowning moment belonged entirely to Dominique. The pristine audio broadcasted her exact shrill voice echoing throughout the massive ballroom. The entire room heard her actively conspiring to defraud the Vanguard estate. They heard her specifically instructing Preston to forge the secondary loan documents. They heard her demanding that he hide the redirected offshore funds through her supposedly separate event planning company to avoid federal detection. The recording played her ruthless, calculated instructions to frame me for their financial crimes if the federal investigators came knocking. The audio laid bare every single layer of her guilt. She was not a victim. She was the architect of the cover-up. Dominique froze. The blood rushed to her face, turning her flawless skin a blotchy, panicked crimson. The high society wives she had been begging for sympathy just moments ago physically stepped away from her in absolute disgust. She looked around wildly, seeing nothing but contempt and severe judgment in the eyes of her peers. Her meticulously crafted reputation, the social empire she had built on lies and stolen money, evaporated into dust right in front of her. I paused the audio and stepped to the center of the room. I looked at the three of them, my father, my brother, and my sister-in-law. I announced that the federal authorities were already reviewing that exact recording. I stated that Vanguard Holdings was officially under my complete control and their fraudulent reign was permanently terminated. Preston finally snapped. The realization that his company was gone, his wife had publicly betrayed him, his freedom was forfeit, and that I was the one holding the executioner's axe completely shattered his fragile, arrogant ego. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unhinged rage. He let out a primal scream, a sound of absolute defeat, and lunged across the marble floor directly at me. His hands formed into tight fists, his bespoke velvet jacket tearing at the seams as he hurled his body weight forward with violent intent. He never made it within 5 feet of me. Arthur Donovan's private security contractors moved with terrifying calculated speed. Before Preston could even bridge the gap, the two massive guards intercepted his path. One guard grabbed Preston's outstretched arm, twisting it sharply behind his back with bone-breaking force, while the second guard drove a heavy shoulder directly into Preston's chest. The impact lifted my brother completely off his feet. They drove him backward with ruthless practiced efficiency and slammed him violently against the solid oak-paneled wall. The heavy thud of his body hitting the wood rattled the crystal wall sconces. The guards pinned him there instantly, crushing his face against the expensive paneling, neutralizing the golden child, without breaking a single sweat. The heavy thud of Preston hitting the oak paneling echoed through the grand ballroom. A collective gasp rippled through the remaining guests. The two massive private security contractors did not flinch. They pressed their weight into my brother, driving the breath from his lungs and pinning him seamlessly against the expensive woodwork. Preston let out a muffled, pathetic wheeze, his bespoke velvet jacket tearing at the shoulder seam as he writhed helplessly against their iron grip. Dominique did not run to her husband. She did not scream for help. Instead, she gathered the torn hem of her silk dress, abandoned her dignity entirely, and sprinted toward the grand foyer, desperately fleeing the catastrophic fallout of her own making. The violent, instantaneous neutralization of the golden child sent a shockwave of absolute terror through the patriarch. Charles stood frozen in the center of the marble floor. The arrogant, untouchable real estate king was gone, replaced by a hollow shell of a man rapidly calculating his own demise. He looked at Preston, pinned and neutralized. He looked at Arthur Donovan, who held the blind trust documents like an executioner's warrant. He looked at the glowing screen of my phone, knowing the federal authorities were currently downloading the exact audio files required to bury him in a maximum security penitentiary for the next 20 years. But the federal wire fraud charges were a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, Charles had a much more immediate lethal problem standing directly in front of him. Victor did not care about the IRS. He did not care about family drama or corporate inheritance. The Russian syndicate leader simply tapped the face of his heavy platinum watch. The sharp metallic click cut through the suffocating tension of the room. Victor tilted his head, his cold, dead eyes boring a hole directly through my father. His three associates shifted their weight in perfect, terrifying synchronization, their hands resting deliberately inside their tailored suit jackets. They were a cartel operating on international black market rules. They did not file lawsuits for breached contracts. They collected their debts in blood. The last shred of Charles's sanity completely vaporized. The realization of his absolute, inescapable ruin finally crushed him. The proud, arrogant patriarch of the Vanguard Empire physically collapsed. His knees hit the polished marble floor with a loud, sickening crack. He did not care that the remaining high society elites were actively recording him. He did not care that his business rivals were watching his total destruction from the shadows of the ballroom. He scrambled forward on his hands and knees, the expensive fabric of his tuxedo pants tearing against the unforgiving stone. He crawled across the spilled champagne, reducing himself to a pathetic, groveling mess. Charles stopped right at the tips of my emerald silk heels. His entire body was shaking with violent tremors. He reached out his thick, sweaty hands, hovering just inches from the hem of my custom gown, too terrified of Julian Vance to actually make physical contact. Charles looked up at me, his face slick with a mixture of sweat and genuine, unadulterated terror. The condescending sneer he had worn my entire life was entirely gone. "Camille, please," he begged, his voice cracking into a ragged, pathetic sob. Hearing him finally say my name without dripping with disdain sent a cold shiver of vindication down my spine. But he was not speaking to a daughter. He was speaking to a bank. "They will kill me!" Charles stammered, his eyes darting frantically toward Victor and the armed men. He gestured wildly with trembling hands, spittle flying from his lips. "You know they will. They do not leave without their money, Camille. You have to fix this." He leaned forward, pressing his forehead toward the floor in a desperate display of submission. He began to bargain with money that was never his to begin with. "You have $30 million, he pleaded, referencing the exact liquid valuation of Vanguard Holdings that he had spent the last 5 years trying to embezzle. "You have the corporate capital. You have to pay them off. You can write the wire transfer right now and make them leave. Just give them the $5 million, Camille. I will do whatever you want. I will sign whatever you need. Just save my life. You have to. You are my daughter." I stood perfectly still. I looked down at the pathetic, broken man weeping at my feet. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel the sudden, overwhelming urge to forgive him that so many abused children are conditioned to feel when their abusers finally beg for mercy. I felt absolutely nothing. I looked at the tears streaming down his flushed, panicked face, and my mind instantly transported back exactly 7 days. I remembered the biting cold of the winter storm. I remembered standing on the front steps of this very estate soaked to the bone in the freezing rain, desperately needing a fraction of the corporate dividends that were legally mine to cover an emergency hospital bill. I remembered Charles standing on the other side of the heavy glass doors, swirling a glass of expensive scotch. He had looked at me shivering in the storm, laughed in my face, and signaled the estate security to forcibly remove me from the property. He had told me that night that I was a genetic mistake, a worthless liability, and that I would never see a single dime of the Vanguard wealth. He had locked the door and left me in the dark. I looked down at him now, the power dynamic permanently, irreversibly inverted. Julian Vance watched me with dark clinical fascination. Donovan stood completely rigid, holding the legal authority of the state. Victor simply waited for his money. I did not step back. I let the heavy, suffocating silence stretch for a long, torturous moment, forcing my father to drown in his own absolute terror. I looked directly into his pleading, desperate eyes, my face completely void of emotion. "I was your daughter last week, when I was standing in the rain," I said, my voice dropping to a chilling, clinical whisper that carried effortlessly across the silent ballroom. "Tonight, I am just a debt collector." Charles stared up at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. The words hung in the air, cold and absolute. I was not his savior. I was his executioner. Victor, who had watched this entire exchange with predatory stillness, finally let out a low, humorless chuckle. The sound broke the paralyzing spell that had gripped the grand ballroom. The Russian syndicate leader stepped past my groveling father, ignoring him completely, and looked directly at me. He gave a single respectful nod. It was a silent acknowledgement between two predators who understood the ruthless mechanics of power. He knew I held the deed, the accounts, and the absolute legal authority. He also knew I was not going to pay Charles's debts. Victor looked down at the pathetic man sweating on the marble floor. He told Charles he had exactly 48 hours to wire the $5 million, plus a 20% inconvenience fee to his offshore account. If the money did not clear by midnight on Thursday, Victor promised that foreclosure would be the absolute least of his problems. With a final chilling glance at the pinned, whimpering Preston, Victor snapped his fingers. The four massive contractors turned in perfect unison and walked out of the ballroom, the heavy oak doors slamming shut behind them with a definitive thud. The immediate physical threat was gone, but the financial slaughter was only just beginning. Charles remained on his knees, weeping openly into his hands entirely broken. Preston was still pressed against the wall by Julian Vance's security team, hyperventilating in total shock. Dominique was huddled near the entryway, desperately trying to call a car service on a phone she could barely hold. The entire Vanguard empire had collapsed in less than 20 minutes. That was when my mother decided to play her final desperate card. Beatrice had stood frozen during Victor's terrifying ultimatum, her eyes darting frantically around the room as she calculated the shifting power dynamics. She looked at her ruined husband on the floor. She looked at her golden boy son in the custody of private security. Finally, she looked at me. I was the only person left standing with any real power, wealth, or authority. The realization clicked behind her heavily manicured eyes. She needed a new host to survive. In a display of emotional whiplash so severe it was almost psychotic, Beatrice completely transformed. The mask of pure, unadulterated outrage she had worn just moments ago melted away. She forced her facial muscles into a wide, trembling smile. She brought a hand up to her chest right over her diamond necklace and let out a loud, theatrical gasp. She forced actual tears to pool in the corners of her surgically tightened eyes. She stepped over Charles's trembling legs, completely ignoring her husband's ongoing breakdown, and moved toward me with her arms outstretched. She cried out my name, her voice echoing with a sickening manufactured warmth. She announced to the silent watching crowd of Hampton's elites that this was all a massive misunderstanding. She took another step toward me, the fake tears now spilling down her cheeks, ruining her expensive makeup. She clasped her hands together in a gesture of overwhelming maternal pride. She declared, her voice trembling with forced emotion. "Oh, my brilliant daughter, I always knew you were special. We always knew you had the vanguard spirit inside you." She looked around the room, gesturing to the stunned investors and socialites attempting to spin the catastrophic humiliation into a planned victory. She laughed, a high-pitched, hysterical sound. She claimed that this entire evening, the secret trust, the brutal financial takeover, the public confrontation, was exactly what they had wanted all along. Beatrice looked back at me, her eyes shining with manic desperation. She reached out, trying to grab my hands. She swore, "We were just testing your business skills, Camille. Your father and I needed to know you were ruthless enough to protect the family legacy, and you passed, darling. You passed the test beautifully." She lunged forward, attempting to pull me into a tight maternal embrace, desperate to project a united front to the gossiping billionaires recording us on their phones. I stepped back, moving with sharp, undeniable disgust. Beatrice stumbled, grasping at empty air. Her arms fell awkwardly to her sides as she stared at me, the fake maternal warmth faltering under the freezing intensity of my gaze. I looked at her perfectly lifted face, the expensive diamonds resting on her collarbone, and the tailored silk gown she had bought using stolen corporate funds. I felt a surge of absolute revulsion. I did not raise my voice, but my words cut through the quiet ballroom like a scalpel. "Testing me?" I asked, my tone dripping with pure toxic venom. "Like when you let me sleep in my car at 19 so you could buy Preston a yacht." Beatrice physically recoiled. The crowd let out a collective sharp intake of breath. The high society wives who had admired Beatrice's supposed charity work now stared at her in absolute horror. The ugly, abusive truth of our family dynamic was now public record, laid bare in front of every prominent investor in New York. I stepped forward, invading her personal space, forcing her to look directly into the eyes of the daughter she had thrown away. "Save the tears, Beatrice," I stated flatly, my voice echoing off the marble walls. "They are ruining your Botox." The collective gasp from the crowd was immediately followed by harsh, stifled laughter from a few rival socialites who had hated Beatrice for years. The humiliation was absolute. My mother's mouth opened and closed silently. The fake, loving smile completely vanished, replaced by a look of pure, naked hatred. The illusion of the loving matriarch shattered permanently. She finally understood that her manipulation tactics, the guilt trips, and the fake affection were completely useless against me. I was immune to her poison. I turned my back on her, dismissing her entire existence with a single fluid motion. I had systematically dismantled their wealth, their reputation, and their false reality. There was only one final piece of business left to conclude. I looked over at Arthur Donovan, who was standing quietly near the cocktail tables, watching the destruction with immense professional satisfaction. I gave him a single, sharp nod. "Serve them," I commanded. Donovan adjusted his tailored suit jacket and stepped forward into the center of the carnage. He unclasped the heavy leather briefcase he had been carrying all evening. He reached inside and produced 4 thick, perfectly bound legal folders. He moved with the calm, methodical precision of a man delivering a fatal diagnosis. He walked over to Charles, dropping the first heavy folder directly onto the marble floor in front of my weeping father. He turned to Beatrice, pressing the second folder firmly into her trembling, manicured hands. He signaled his security contractors, who slightly loosened their grip on Preston, just long enough for Donovan to shove the third folder against my brother's chest. Finally, Donovan walked toward the foyer, tracking down Dominique, and handed her the fourth and final folder. Donovan pressed the fourth and final heavy folder into Dominique's trembling hands. The entire grand ballroom held its collective breath. The ambient noise of the Hamptons estate had completely vanished, leaving only the sharp, distinct rustle of thick parchment paper as Charles tore open his folder. His bloodshot eyes scanned the first page. The color drained from his face all over again, replaced by a sickly, chalky white. His hands shook so violently that the legal documents almost slipped from his grasp, fluttering against his ruined tuxedo pants. It was a formal, legally binding 30-day eviction notice, but that was merely the cover page. Beneath it lay a massive, heavily documented civil lawsuit demanding immediate restitution for 5 years of unpaid rent. Attached to that was a staggering penalty assessment for unauthorized property damage and severe structural alterations. Charles looked up, his jaw unhinged. He sputtered that this was impossible, that he was the undisputed master of the Vanguard estate, that he had lived here and managed the grounds since Theodore's passing. He yelled, his voice echoing frantically off the vaulted ceilings, that he had built the new south wing, installed the infinity pool overlooking the ocean, and upgraded the entire security infrastructure. He demanded to know how I could possibly evict him from a home he had personally modernized and maintained. He pointed wildly to the imported marble floors and the antique crystal chandeliers, claiming he had paid for all of it with his own hard-earned money. I took a slow, deliberate step toward him. I kept my voice perfectly level, letting the immaculate acoustics of the grand ballroom carry my words to every single silent investor, politician, and socialite watching the spectacle unfold. Because I owned the house, I stated clearly, my words cutting through his hysterical defense like a blade. Theodore legally transferred the master deed to my name 5 years ago. You were never the owner, Charles. You were merely a tenant living under a blind trust. And because you were only a tenant, every single modification you made, every load-bearing wall you tore down, every expensive contractor you hired to build that infinity pool was entirely unauthorized. Charles staggered backward, clutching the thick folder to his chest, as if the heavy paper could shield him from the truth. He shook his head in rapid, desperate denial, sweat pouring down his forehead, but I was not finished. And more importantly, I continued closing the distance between us until I was standing directly over him. Every secret secondary mortgage you took out using this address as collateral constitutes federal bank fraud. You leveraged a multi-million-dollar property you did not legally own to fund Preston's failing commercial ventures. You lied to the regional banks. You lied to your private investors. You willfully forged legal documents claiming an ownership stake you did not possess. And you lied to Victor. I looked directly into his panicked, hyperventilating face. I let the absolute reality of his situation crash down on him. I am not just kicking you out. I explained, my tone entirely void of emotion. I am foreclosing on you. The high society crowd surrounding us erupted into a fresh wave of scandalous whispers. Wall Street executives began rapidly texting their brokers, pulling their funds from Vanguard accounts before the market opened. A few feet away, Beatrice ripped open her own folder. Her breath hitched a sharp, ragged sound that echoed in the quiet room. Inside was a comprehensive forensic audit of her personal spending over the last half-decade. Every stolen corporate dividend she had funneled into her offshore accounts to pay for her plastic surgery, her designer wardrobes, and her extravagant European vacations had been meticulously tracked, categorized, and reported directly to the Internal Revenue Service. The folder contained a formal demand for immediate repayment, backed by federal asset seizure warrants. She dropped the papers onto the marble floor, as if they had physically burned her manicured fingers. She covered her mouth, looking around the room for a single sympathetic face, but found only cold, calculating stares from the women she had called her friends. She finally realized that she would be leaving this estate with nothing but the clothes on her back. Dominique frantically tore open her folder. She expected to find her divorce papers or a simple severance agreement that would allow her to walk away from the Vanguard collapse with her social standing intact. Instead, she found a mountain of heavily highlighted financial ledgers. Donovan had successfully traced the $5 million of syndicate money directly through her supposedly separate luxury event planning company. The documents proved she had actively laundered Victor's money to hide it from the federal auditors. She was legally implicated in the exact same federal wire fraud conspiracy that was about to send her husband to a maximum security penitentiary. Her shell company was nothing more than a clearinghouse for stolen funds, and I had handed the entire paper trail over to the authorities. Dominique let out a shrill, piercing shriek. She dropped the folder, the paper scattering across the floor, and spun around to face Preston. Her husband was still pinned firmly against the oak paneling by Julian Vance's massive security contractors. The elite Hamptons wives Dominique had spent years desperately trying to impress were now actively recording her total meltdown on their phones. She marched right up to her husband, her face twisted into a mask of absolute unhinged panic. She screamed at Preston to do something. She slapped her hands against his torn velvet jacket, demanding that he call his lawyers, call his investors, or leverage his company's remaining assets to save her from a federal indictment. She yelled that she refused to go to prison for his stupidity. She demanded he fix the accounts, liquidate his stock options, and pay off the debt immediately so she could retain her freedom. Preston slowly lifted his head. The arrogant, untouchable golden child was completely gone. His face was bruised where the guards had driven him into the wall. His eyes were hollow dead and utterly defeated. He looked at his screaming wife, observing her panic with a disturbing, apathetic silence. He then looked past her locking eyes directly with me across the ballroom floor. Preston let out a weak, ragged sigh. He slumped against the wall, utterly destroyed by the absolute finality of my trap, and whispered, "I can't. She owns my company's debt. We are completely bankrupt." Preston's utterly defeated whisper hung in the dead, suffocating air of the ballroom. Dominique stared at her husband, her face twisting from panic into a mask of pure, visceral revulsion. The man she had married for his limitless trust fund and guaranteed corporate ascension was now nothing more than a ruined, penniless fraud pinned against a wall. She took a slow, deliberate step away from him, physically distancing herself from the stench of his failure. But the family drama meant absolutely nothing to the men in charcoal suits standing near the grand entrance. Victor had listened to Preston's pathetic confession with predatory stillness. The Russian syndicate leader processed the word bankrupt with chilling efficiency. A man with temporary liquidity issues could find $5 million in 48 hours. A man who was completely bankrupt, facing federal indictment and being actively foreclosed upon by his own daughter, was a dead asset. Victor knew that by morning, the federal authorities would freeze every single Vanguard account. The window to extract his syndicate's money was closing by the second. Victor stepped forward, his heavy leather shoes striking the marble floor with the rhythmic, terrifying cadence of a ticking clock. He completely ignored Dominique's whimpering and Preston's bruised, bleeding face. He walked directly up to my father, who was still kneeling in the spilled champagne, clutching his eviction notice like a shield. Victor did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He crouched down slightly, bringing his cold, dead eyes level with my father's terrified gaze. He informed Charles that the previous grace period was officially revoked. 48 hours was a courtesy extended to legitimate businessmen experiencing temporary cash flow problems. Charles was not a businessman. He was a common thief who had stolen from a cartel that did not recognize corporate bankruptcy as a valid excuse for non-payment. Victor stated with absolute terrifying calm that Charles now had exactly 1 hour to produce the $5 million in liquid, untraceable funds. If the money was not secured in their offshore accounts, in exactly 60 minutes, the syndicate would bypass the legal system entirely. Victor promised that things would immediately get physical and they would start taking their payment in flesh. Charles let out a strangled, breathless gasp. His chest heaved as panic completely overwhelmed his nervous system. 60 minutes. It was an impossible demand. He looked around the grand ballroom, his eyes darting frantically across the sea of designer gowns and custom tuxedos. These were his people. These were the elite hedge fund managers he golfed with, the politicians he funded, the real estate tycoons he hosted every summer. They possessed billions in combined wealth. Charles scrambled to his feet, slipping awkwardly on the wet marble. He rushed toward a group of prominent Wall Street executives standing near the ice sculptures. He begged them for a bridge loan. He pleaded, sweat pouring down his face and soaking his collar, promising 20, 30, 50% interest if they would just wire the funds to Victor immediately. The executives physically recoiled. Men who had eagerly drank his expensive champagne just an hour ago now backed away from him as if he were carrying a highly contagious disease. They averted their eyes, shaking their heads in disgust, refusing to even acknowledge his pathetic existence. In their world, a bankrupt man facing federal wire fraud was entirely radioactive, finding zero mercy from his peers. Charles spun around wildly, his desperate gaze locked onto his wife. Beatrice was still standing near the cocktail tables, staring blankly at the forensic audit detailing her imminent federal asset seizure. Charles lunged at her. He did not ask. He did not explain. He grabbed Beatrice by the shoulders, his thick fingers digging brutally into her skin, and began violently clawing at the heavy diamond tennis bracelet secured around her wrist. Beatrice shrieked a high-pitched, ugly sound that tore through the pristine acoustics of the room. She fought back, slapping at his hands, desperately trying to protect the last physical remnants of her stolen wealth. The Grand Patriarch and the elegant hostess of the Vanguard Empire were now reduced to a physical savage brawl in the middle of their own ballroom, fighting like feral animals over a piece of jewelry. Charles overpowered her, ripping the platinum bracelet from her wrist, with enough force to snap the safety clasp. He shoved her backward, ignoring her hysterical sobbing, and spun back toward the crowd of stunned investors. He held the glittering diamond bracelet high in the air, his chest heaving, his face red and slick with desperation. He shouted to the room, offering the custom piece for a fraction of its value. He yelled that it was appraised at $2 million, begging anyone to write him a check for $500,000. He ripped a massive sapphire ring from his own finger and threw it onto a glass table, adding it to the desperate auction. He barked out numbers, lowering the price with every passing second, offering his wife's blood diamonds to anyone willing to save his life. The elite guests simply watched in silent, unadulterated disgust. No one reached for their checkbooks. No one offered a single dollar. They merely clutched their designer bags tighter and watched the Vanguard King peddle his stolen jewelry like a desperate street merchant. I stood perfectly still, watching the man who had repeatedly lectured me on financial responsibility destroy himself. This was the same father who had told me I was a terrible investment because I refused to marry his golf buddy's idiot son to secure a corporate merger. This was the man who had starved my design company of capital, claiming I lacked the ruthless instinct required to survive in high finance. Now he was begging for spare change in the ruins of the empire I had legally conquered. Victor watched the pathetic display with cold, clinical detachment. He was entirely unimpressed by Charles's frantic auction. He knew pawned jewelry would not cover a $5 million syndicate debt. Victor gave a subtle, silent nod to the massive man standing to his right. The associate reached inside his charcoal suit jacket and pulled out a heavy, encrypted satellite phone. He did not try to hide his actions. He held the device up deliberately, letting the harsh overhead lights catch the matte black casing. He looked at his platinum dive watch, then looked directly at Charles, who had stopped screaming as the reality of the phone call registered. The associate dialed a secure number. He spoke rapidly in Russian, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that sent a fresh wave of terror through the room. The specific words were foreign, but the harsh, lethal tone required absolutely no translation. He was calling in the associates. He was initiating the cleanup protocol. Victor stepped back, folding his arms across his chest. He looked at Charles and delivered the final, inescapable truth. The countdown had officially begun. The digital numbers on the associate's platinum watch seemed to flash in the minds of everyone present. 60 minutes separated my father from a brutal, unspeakable fate. And yet, looking at the room full of billionaires who could easily save him with a single phone call, I knew he would not raise a single dime. I decided to make absolutely certain of it. I turned away from Victor and his men, smoothing the front of my emerald silk gown, and walked gracefully toward the center of the ballroom. The elite guests had formed a wide, terrified circle around our family, their eyes wide with morbid fascination. They were the apex predators of Wall Street, ruthless venture capitalists, and untouchable socialites, and they were watching the Vanguard dynasty bleed out on the marble floor. I looked around the room, making direct eye contact with the very people who had shunned me for years, at my parents' behest. I raised my voice, ensuring it carried effortlessly to the farthest corners of the vaulted room. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, my tone conversational, clinical, and completely devoid of panic. "I apologize for the sudden disruption to the evening's festivities, but since you have all been invited here under the guise of celebrating the Vanguard family's immense success, I feel it is only right that you understand exactly what you are witnessing." I gestured broadly to the lavish decorations, the towering ice sculptures melting onto the pristine tablecloths, and the tables groaning under the weight of imported delicacies. "Everything you see tonight is an illusion," I declared, my voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "The Vanguard Trust is empty. The real estate empire is entirely heavily mortgaged, and the operational capital has been completely drained to cover Preston's catastrophic business failures and Beatrice's offshore shopping sprees. Charles Vanguard does not own this estate. He does not own the company. He is a bankrupt fraud currently facing federal indictment for wire fraud."